So I'm pleased to introduce Louise Anamat. She is currently the Executive Director of Library Information Services and Dixon Librarian at the State Library of New South Wales, and has previously assumed various roles at the library since 2006. She's had a major involvement in establishing the library as a major investor in Dunera historical artefacts and papers. Louise has published and lectured widely on the library's collections and has worked closely with the acquisition, processing and curation of the manuscript and pictures collections over many years. She's the author of Natural Curiosity, Unseen Art of the First Fleet, New South Publishing 2014, an analysis of the traditions of natural history art production in Australia and Britain during the 18th and 19th centuries. Louise also spoke at our 79th anniversary event in 2019 at the Jewish Museum here in Sydney. Louise, we warmly welcome you here as our guest speaker today. Thank you.
So it is such a pleasure to be back here with you in 2022 after having met some of you in 2019, then followed by that strangeness and disappointment of 2020 and 2021. My division at the library has oversight and responsibility for the library's collections. So what's acquired, how, when, how it's catalogued, made available for research through the library's online catalogues and reading rooms. Excellent, perfect. Just the lectern mic. That's great. How or where it's stored, the level of conservation care and intervention it receives, and curation and research of the collections. So I'd like to look a little at the role of the library in the context of Dunera, in safeguarding memories for society, of course, but also for individuals, for their families, their descendants, so that their very individual pasts, which make up our whole, are not forgotten. There continue to be many views, questions, opinions on memorialisation, and not only in relation to the Holocaust, what is or is not acceptable in terms of representation and commemoration. We've seen that in relation to reactions to long-standing statues of usually great white men and decolonisation debates around the world, who should or should not have the right to represent events, how events such as the Holocaust might be represented to ensure commemoration. And this is where I think libraries can play a particular role, collecting institutions more broadly. But I'm going to talk about libraries. Libraries are neutral. Libraries do not discriminate. Their collecting is broad and small c Catholic, as it should be. It's nice to think of the library for a moment not as a large and complex organisation with competing funding needs, and I've been chatting to colleagues from the Maritime Museum and the National Library and just today, and they've mentioned competing funding needs, but that's really the boring side of collecting institutions. But I'd rather speak of the library as a place for holding memory, as an information, a knowledge machine, if you like, which very much implies the relevance of the library. And we're adding value to our loads and our stores of information. And I'm really keen for the library to promote this view of itself, of contributing to articulating and describing, even creating Australian society and culture. We can justifiably say that most histories of Australia, its political, economic, social and cultural life, must at some point reference library collections such as those at the State Library. Of course, libraries don't only impact on great historians and writers, and I want you to remember this. Countless individuals and family historians look for evidence of their past. Many people have sat in the library's reading rooms seeking or generating knowledge or facts and understanding, but finding things, large and small, that are just as meaningful to them as grand narratives are to famous historians. Libraries are as near to democratic institutions as you can get in the cultural sector. Access to collections and information has always been a key principle. Now, libraries, of course, don't have a monopoly on knowledge, and discourses external to the library will have a telling impact on what's collected and the way collections are interpreted. Library knowledge emerges from this sort of an alchemy of collections, I like to think of it, an alchemy of collections, readers, and the contemporary intellectual milieu. While collections themselves are static things with fixed inscriptions or images upon them, how people engage with and interpret the information within them is a matter of some philosophical inquiry. And this is where the record of the Dunera experience in Australia becomes so important. On so many levels, especially as our own Holocaust refugees and survivors age and they and their families reflect on their lives and experiences, their legacies and memories. Since 2019, in particular, we've been very busy building the library's Dunera collections. And today I'm going to speak briefly about some of the collections relating to the Dunera transportation and internment experience without pretending that the library's collection is comprehensive or in any way complete. It isn't. But it is a collecting area that we've been focusing a lot of effort and attention on, working with Seamus Spark and his many contacts. And it was Pauline Lyle-Smith, who I'm looking at now, who actually made the connection between Seamus and me a number of years ago. And Seamus has been so generous with his time and knowledge and played a huge part in building the Dunera legacy with the State Library. The record of Australia's Dunera boys is extensive and important, and mostly still held and cared for by the families of the boatload of enemy alien refugees who arrived in Australia in 1940. You mostly know this story well. I'm really just going to skip over it. When war was declared in September 1939, and the British government began deporting its foreigners, particularly German-speaking foreigners, as enemy aliens. Many were Jewish, but not all, or had Jewish heritage, and reading the signs had escaped Nazi persecution at home by travelling to Britain before or immediately following the outbreak of war, and who then found themselves reclassified, often after years of living and working in Britain, as enemy aliens, and ultimately transported and trapped in internment camps in Canada or Australia. So the Dunera, carrying around 2,500 men and boys, arrived first in Western Australia at Fremantle on the 27th of August 1940, Melbourne on the 3rd of September, and in Sydney here on the 6th of September. The Dunera boys, as they became known, after a 2-month journey in appalling conditions, included ordinary men and boys, many of whom were musicians, artists, philosophers, scientists, writers, schoolboys, living ordinary lives. And following their release and at the end of the war, 900 of the original Dunera boys chose to remain in Australia. And that's where most of you come in. But what messages do Dunera stories have for us now as a nation in a new era, more than 80 years after Dunera's arrival, when these enemy aliens, forced from their country, discarded from Britain, disembarked and interned in Australia, not only as a record of their and their family stories, but as a reflection on refugee stories today, years after Dunera, in a new century, in a supposedly different Australia. And I know this has been an area that's been debated amongst Dunera boys and your families for a long time. The State Library holds the papers of an increasing number of Dunera boys. One of those, now where do I point this, Mitch? Up?
It's coming up already.
Is it?
Yes, it's high.
Oh, I'm looking at the wrong side. Okay, we've got it. One of those was, and this image doesn't relate to Fred Gruen, one of those was Viennese-born Fred Gruen, formerly Fritz Gruen, who became a respected academic and economist in Australia. Gruen left Vienna for England as a 15-year-old in 1936 and continued his schooling in England until recategorised as both, at the same time, enemy alien and refugee from Nazi oppression, and deported on the Dunera. He never saw his parents again. His father died while he was living in England, and he later learned that his mother had been deported to Theresienstadt and then disappeared in Auschwitz. Later in life, Gruen reflected that he and his Dunera comrades, and Ban Brandt also alluded to this, had been comparatively lucky. He was one of the first internees to be admitted to University of Melbourne, taking most of his courses after his internment while still serving in the 8th Employment Company of the Australian Army, so that those unarmed Australian army companies manned by non-British subjects who they didn't fight, but they undertook essential war work within Australia. Gruen later initiated a series of reviews of Australian economics, founded the Centre for Economic Policy Research, and worked for the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet as a special consultant and independent economic advisor to Gough Whitlam. Another was Henry Lippmann, born in Berlin in 1921, the elder of 2 sons of a Jewish family. And this folder is the Hessian stationery wallet that Henry made while he was in internment that he kept his letters in. Henry was known to his family then as Heinz, and he attended an international ORT school, so an organisation for rehabilitation and training. In August 1939, ORT evacuated 100 Jewish boys to Britain on the so-called Kinder transport, and Henry was among them. Interned in Britain, Henry was then transported again, this time to Australia on board the Dunera, and interned first in Hay and then in Tatura. Now, Henry's collection at the library consists of, it basically fitted into this little Hessian folder, basically consists of the letters and postcards his parents and, movingly, his younger brother Kurt had sent to Henry in Australia, first from Berlin and then other places as they were relocated, so transported to ghettos and camps. Kurt's letters and postcards to Henry are really sweet. They're filled with the 2 boys' really cheeky, endearing nicknames for each other. And the letters from his parents were filled with news of family, friends, birthdays and outings, and an attempt at a normal life. At first unwilling to migrate, Henry's father, Leo, believed, and Ruth Lippmann writes this in one of her letters to Henry, that Leo believed, like many German Jews at that time, that his war service with the German army during World War I would protect them from the worst persecutions. Later, they were unable to migrate. They'd left it too late. The Lippmann family then was transported to Warsaw Ghetto on the 5th of April 1942, and I mentioned that date because it was the day before Kurt's 17th birthday. The last news Henry received from his family came via the Red Cross, and it was dated June 1942. The mass deportations from that ghetto had begun in July, and it wasn't until after the war, as for so many people, that he learned his father, mother and brother had perished in Travnicki labour camp in Poland. The library also conducted an oral history with Henry, and in it he records movingly his family's farewell on the train platform that day in Berlin. And Ed and I have spoken about this too. Ed wrote to me about this after I spoke in 2019. The family had actually said their farewells at home, and Henry set off then for Charlottenburg train station. And every time I'm on Charlottenburg train station, I think of Henry, reluctant to let their son go, but knowing it was almost certainly for the best, and knowing they might not see each other again for a long while, if at all. His parents and brother then also made their way to Charlottenburg. And in his excitement, surrounded by his school friends and probably not realising the enormity of this train trip, Henry was not thrilled to see his parents. And this is, Ed has told me about this too. He recounted this story to me, that as his parents stood on the platform staring at him for what would be the last time, Henry exclaimed, as can be the way of teenage children, "What did you come here for?" His last words to his parents, who he never saw again. Now, it's a really small story, but it's held now forever by the library, and it still breaks my heart. While interned, Henry kept a meticulous listing of the letters he wrote and those that he received from family and friends in in Berlin. And he stored his letters, as I said, in this handmade Hessian stationery wallet with his initials. The H has dropped off, but it was HLL for Heinz Louis Lippmann, attached in cut-out leather. There's also a small bundle of letters. Yes. There's also a small bundle of letters written by Arthur Court. Oh. I'm going to have to get used to the slight delay. A small bundle of letters written by Arthur Court Hirschfeld, who later took the name Hurst, from internment to his mother. And they've been recently acquired. And these were acquired through a dealer, through Maggs Brothers in London. And letters of Rainer Radock to his friends. And these small collections, Henry's, Arthur's, Rainer's, might seem slight for a collecting institution, but I don't actually see it that way. The Holocaust stories, the refugees, the individuals caught up in the Holocaust, they're often masked by the sheer number of its victims, and collections such as the Lippmann, Hirschfeld and Radock family letters that were being kept and treasured help translate those incomprehensible statistics into people. In mid-2019, the library received the collection of another Dunera boy, Viennese-born Georg Telcher, later George Adams. Telcher Adams was a highly trained artist. He'd studied at the Bauhaus Art School in Weimar under its famous founder Walter Gropius. He studied under Austrian artist Julius Klinger, German artist Oskar Schlemmer. He attended painting workshops by Russian artist Vasily Kandinsky. He left Austria in 1938 for London ahead of World War II, where he took his American mother's name, Adams, and dropped Telcher. Classified as an enemy alien and transported to Australia, he returned to Britain in 1941 after internment and became a British citizen. And it was Telcher Adams who designed the Hay internment currency. And this is his... Yep, you were watching my thumb. And this is his personal set that he that he retained against orders that it be destroyed. So the authorities sort of let them create the currency and then sort of went, oh, this is a bit like forgery, and then ordered it to be destroyed. But a lot of people kept theirs, and this was Telcher's set. And I'm sure you all know, around the barbed wire edging, embedded the words, if you really look, we're here because we're here because we're here, and it goes all the way around. Telcher's collection of internment drawings and currency were acquired from his widow Sarah in London. Now, Sarah doesn't have internet or email, she doesn't believe in them, and so I spent many hours on the phone with her in the evenings here, mornings in London, as we worked through the details of her husband's collection, and she shared many of their experiences and stories, including lunching with Gropius and her own fascinating story. So I'll just flick through some. These are some of Telcher Adams' drawings from the camp. And the depiction of Hirschfeld Max is probably the best known, but the depiction of the guard boxes and the internment, the barbed wire, are fairly common.
Where are these held?
At the State Library, yeah. And this is a program that Telcher designed for a play, and this was the standard stationery that they could use to write their letters, and this is sort of recognising that, you know, this whole thing had been a monumental, stuff up, and they were writing official letters as well. So, the other thing, I must show you this, that was included in Telcher's papers is this pop-up book, like a children's pop-up book style paper model of the exterior and the interior of a camp hut that was made by Eli Rosenblut. Now, I'll show you, I did have a little video of this, but I didn't trust us being able to do it So the roof opened up. Oops. The whole thing opened up just like a classic pop-up book. So this then led to conversations with Nick Ross from the BBC in London, who is the son of Eli Rosenblut. And I believe now that there are 2 models, this one now at the State Library and one other which is privately held. The papers of art historian Ernst Kitzinger were presented to the library by his 3 children, Rachel, Tony and Adrian, in 2020. Kitzinger must have been an amazing man. He completed his PhD dissertation in record time, in only 12 months, ahead of leaving Germany in 1934 because he knew of the threat that Jewish students would be banned from attending university after the Nazi Party had come to power the previous year. He moved to London and he worked at the British Museum, was highly respected there, and then was deported on the Dunera. And he was very active in seeking improved conditions and justice and compensation for the internees. And following his release, Kitzinger settled in Washington, was eventually appointed Professor of Byzantine Art and Archaeology, his specialisation, and he had a very long and very productive academic career. Viennese artist Robert Hofmann, I'm so aware of getting there. Okay. Hofmann was 51 and amongst the oldest of those deported on the Dunera. Hofmann had had a full life ahead of leaving Europe. He'd studied at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. He'd served in the Austrian military during World War I and then continued his art studies after the war. And he'd built a successful career as an artist in Vienna. And his collection includes landscapes and portraits created by him in London, where he worked for a time as a sort of artist in residence at Harrods. They apparently even set up a little studio space for him. The collection also includes the drawings that he did on the Dunera and in internment camps. So these are Dunera images below decks and washing themselves. And then in the camps. And his collection is full of portraits, a lot of them unidentified and some identified. Now, I met Muriel Barber and her son Richard only on Friday when they came to the library to see the second image of Herbert Barber, which I had, without knowing, already included in this slide presentation. So it was really nice to meet them. And then the portraits are absolutely stunning. They're all very good. The quality is variable, but they're all very good. And some of them they are so exquisite, given the materials and the conditions. You can sense that some of them are amazing, and you can sense that there was something else between Hofmann and these men and boys. Hofmann never returned to Europe after the war. In Melbourne, he stayed in Melbourne and he was naturalised as an Australian. And then eventually he settled in Syracuse in New York State, where one of his sisters was living. And he worked there as an artist and art teacher. And then 2 of his students, Mark Topp and James Skvarch, became firstly close friends, and then following Hofmann's death, the custodians of Hofmann's extensive collection of art, which has now been acquired last year by the State Library. So it includes these many excellent portraits. And we're hoping that the unidentified portraits, the unidentified portraits over time through families, and Seamus, of course, can piece together a lot of these, but we're hoping that over time families will help us actually identify the unidentified sitters. So if you recognise anyone, let us know. And then one of the most recently received collections is this one, the drawings of Klaus Friederberger, including a drawing that Julie, his wife, described as being on a piece of precious Dunera issue toilet paper, along with internment images and drawings, Klaus's drawings from the 8th Australian Employment Company Army Unit. At 16, Friedeberger left Berlin to attend a boarding school in the Netherlands that was a refuge for German and Jewish children from the Nazi regime. Then in 1939, he went to Britain as a refugee, same story, declared enemy alien in that same year and deported to Australia and interned, where he formed a lifelong friendship with fellow internee Erwin Fabian. And this first I haven't even touched it. This first drawing is a portrait, a little sketch of Klaus sleeping in his bunk in the internment camp by Erwin Fabian. And Fabian remained in Australia and became renowned as a sculptor. Following his release then, Klaus enrolled at East Sydney Technical College, now the National Art School, and while he was there he met and exhibited with Sidney Nolan and Arthur Boyd, and then in 1950 he sailed to Europe on the proceeds of the Mossman Art Prize, which must have been enough then that you could do that, settled in London and established himself as an artist and art teacher. Now, Klaus died in London in 2019, and his widow, Julie, contacted me and transferred his vast collection of watercolours and sketches to the State Library just this year. The library's also received the drawings of Paul Mazulianic, and a number of other collections are in the pipeline. So if there are collections out there and you think they're too small and insignificant, think again about their preservation. The library's collections cover the diversity of cultural, social, and indeed political experience of people in New South Wales. The experience of internees, supposed enemy aliens during both World Wars, has been a long-standing collection focus for us at the State Library. For me, one of the wonderful flow-ons from the Dunera-related collections the library has received during the past several years, since I last spoke to you in 2019, has been meeting the families, sometimes in person, often via Zoom, sometimes from those long phone conversations across time zones or long email correspondences with the widows and children of Dunera boys and the people whose lives they've touched. So Julie Friedeberger, widow of Klaus, Rachel Kitzinger, daughter of Ernst, Robert Hoffman students, Mark Topp and James Skvarch, Sarah Adams, widow of George Telcher Adams, Emil Tunen, studio assistant of Erwin Fabian, Gabriella Schönbach, daughter of Fritz Schönbach, Paul Chodzizna, grandson of Georg, Frank Hoffman, son of Peter. I'm hoping these names mean something to you. Lynette, widow of Henry Talbot, Ed Lipman, of course, and his lovely mum, Julie, who I met in 2019, Richard and Muriel now, and a number of others. And I sort of feel like I'm not entirely out of place here. I don't have a Dunera connection, but I am the daughter of a Dutch migrant who didn't arrive at Jones Bay Wharf. He flew in. And many of you who I've known really just met today or met a couple of days ago, and I'm looking at Conrad Kveet, who I've known longer than anyone in this room, who I met as a 17-year-old undergraduate because Conrad was one of my lecturers at the University of New South Wales when I came home from being at school in Germany. So speaking at a Dunera reunion in the 1990s, Fred Gruen referenced the refugee debate, and Ed just mentioned this to me over lunch as well. And Gruen asked whether there weren't selfish as well as moral arguments for Australia to take a more liberal attitude to people currently desperately seeking asylum. And the example of the Dunera, he said, and this is a quote, suggests that what are widely regarded as undesirables at one time later usually become useful citizens of the country admitting them, and often highly regarded members of society. And we can say that with certainty about the Dunera boys. The Dunera story addresses critical questions around the place and treatment of refugees and migrants within Australian society. the bureaucracy that underpinned their escape first to Britain and then their release from internment in Australia and finding somewhere to settle and build a life is uncomfortably familiar to those paying attention to current world crises. The politics of refugees remains fraught, not only in Australia but across the world, as we're now 1 year into the current crisis in Afghanistan and several months into the invasion of Ukraine, as thousands of asylum seekers continue to be turned away for the ostensible fear that they would burden the state, regardless of the threat to their lives in their home countries. The Dunera collections, the letters and diaries and drawings are an eyewitness record of the activity and remarkable creativity and determination, but also the lethargy of everyday life in Australia's internment camps during 1940 to 1942, recording an important aspect of Australian wartime experience, of the transportation and internment of foreigners, of the Jewish diaspora, and of the attitude of the British and Australian governments to asylum seekers and refugees during World War II. It's a story where racism and anti-Semitism and the expulsion of German speakers as enemy aliens became entwined with British-Australian colonial discourse. Libraries don't authorise one output of knowledge over another, any single interpretation, but they can help shape the emphasis of the creation of knowledge. It can be argued that fundamental decisions, such as collecting one type of material over another, do help shape or frame the knowledge which emerges from libraries. The record of the Dunera boys preserved at the library is part of that framing. If we didn't have these collections, then we would, and this is important, we would have very different histories being written about our past and therefore also different formulations about our future. Imagine if our only record of the Dunera were the government official record. It would be a very different story that we'd know. Collections are at the heart of what we do at the State Library. Most of us working there, one of the biggest and most sophisticated research libraries in the country, would see knowledge as the practical output of research, that a body of facts and ideas is generated from the interrogation and interpretation of its collections. I realise this definition may be very basic, but it does encapsulate the way that libraries tend to view their mission. Where galleries and museums tend to collect outstanding exemplars of cultural production, libraries collect more extensively, from great works of art through to bad art, if it tells a story, to government publications through to innocent-seeming, uninteresting-seeming private letters and diaries, or the musings of family historians through to ephemera. Because of their size, research libraries are often said to be memory institutions, with the implication very much that they're places where memories are stored and nurtured. Perhaps an equally appropriate, valid way of describing them is as places where memories are made, where memories are created. Memories are, after all, a kind of knowledge. Memories are generated from the sparks between the collections and our readers, sparks generated by the activity of excavation, of falling down rabbit holes and searching, and it's this alchemy of research which generates meaning. Today, we're much more sceptical of there being a one true knowledge. We're far less likely to believe that an historian or researcher will uncover the definitive account of some event. We're much more likely to look for multiple meanings in the past. We understand that knowledge is not of itself value-free, but very much part of a complex matrix of the way people engage with and describe their society. Out of these complex interactions emerge knowledge and memories, your family memories, the past of your fathers or grandfathers, your husbands, your Dunera boys. Their individual approaches to what life had dealt them derives from the stories you may have been told throughout your lives. There are, of course, various caveats on libraries and their knowledge machinery. They can be subjective, they're rarely complete, they often favour the powerful. But we should acknowledge their centrality to the way we think about our past, present and future. Library collections may be flawed, but their limitations should be understood. But they remain fantastically important to the national knowledge infrastructure. Memory, knowledge is a complex beast. Knowledge is, as people often say, power, but that perhaps overstates the case. Knowledge can be power. Libraries such as the State Library are by no means the only machines of knowledge available to a society, but they remain an essential component of the way we think, create and manage our past, our present and our future, and includes knowledge of the many varied events that have shaped and influenced our past and our present. And acknowledgement that as a society and a nation, we sometimes, often, fail to learn from our past, that we repeat our past. That measure of learning from our past is an important legacy of the Dunera boys and their many stories that continues to resonate rather than diminish with the passing of time. Oh, and this photo that I received on Friday afternoon, late on Friday afternoon, that Gabriela Schönbach sent to me, that is her father Fritz on the left and Klaus Friedeberger. We have no idea who took it, but I love it because it's so casual. And yeah, so thank you.
I'd like to thank Louise very much for her presentation, and she has shown us again the value that libraries give to the retention and the explaining and talking about our histories, and we can't be any more appreciative as a Dunera family to the State Library of the State Library of New South Wales. So I've got a small gift for you, Louise, something that might help you enjoy life even more, and particularly in relation to gastronomic delights. Thank you very much. Thank you.